Hello, my love. Welcome to Stories with Oge Pleasure. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Please share the video with friends and loved ones. Also turn on the notifications to get notified for next stories. Sit back, let's dive into the story.
A beautiful waitress took a bold step that could make her or break her. She warned a billionaire about his friend's plot to betray him. And here is what happened. Kelvin adjusted his necktie, his mind buzzing with anticipation. The luxurious cafe was alive with low murmurs, clinking silverware, and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Today was supposed to be monumental, a day that would cement his legacy. Alongside his childhood friend and business partner, Edward Ease, he was on the brink of signing a deal that would take their company to unimaginable heights. As Kelvin glanced at the contract on the polished mahogany table, a wave of pride washed over him. This was the culmination of years of hard work, late nights, and sacrifices. Yet, there was an odd tension in the air, one he couldn't quite place. "I'll just use the restroom," Kelvin said, pushing back his chair. Edward barely looked up from his phone, offering a distracted nod. Kelvin paused for a moment, his instinct whispering something he couldn't interpret, but he brushed it aside. At another corner of the cafe, Kim Johnson balanced a tray of glasses, her sharp eyes darting between tables. She had worked at this high-end establishment for months, blending into the background as wealthy patrons carried on with their lives. She knew her place. Unseen, unimportant, just another waitress. But today was different. As she approached Edward and Kelvin's table to refill their water, a snippet of conversation stopped her in her tracks. Edward, leaning slightly to the side, spoke in a hushed tone into his phone. His words were venomous and deliberate. "Everything is set. Kelvin doesn't suspect a thing. Once the deal is signed, the company's mine. He'll never see it coming." Kim's breath hitched, and her hand trembled slightly, nearly spilling the water. She stepped back quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. Did she hear that correctly? Edward was planning to betray Kelvin, the man who had trusted him, who had built an empire with him. She retreated to the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter as if it could anchor her spinning thoughts. Her conscience screamed at her. She could pretend she hadn't heard anything, keep her head down like she always did. It wasn't her business after all. But deep down, Kim knew she couldn't walk away. Not this time. As Kelvin returned to the table, Edward greeted him with a smile so warm it bordered on disarming. Kim watched from a distance, her stomach churning. The sight of Edward's facade only strengthened her resolve. Gathering every ounce of courage, she approached the table, her steps hesitant but determined. "Excuse me, Mr. Agu," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the cafe's chatter. Kelvin looked up, surprised that the waitress was addressing him directly. "Yes." Kim hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of her tray. Her pulse raced, and she glanced nervously toward Edward, who had stepped outside to take another call. This was her moment, and she couldn't let it slip away. "I need to tell you something," she said, lowering her voice. "It's important." Kelvin frowned, puzzled but attentive. "What is it?" Kim swallowed hard. "I overheard something. Your partner, Edward. I think he's planning to betray you." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Kelvin stared at her, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "What did you say?" Kim's voice trembled, but she pressed on. "He was on the phone, talking about taking over the company after the deal is signed. He said you wouldn't suspect a thing." Kelvin's immediate reaction was denial. Edward, his best friend since childhood. The man he had trusted with his life and livelihood. It was unthinkable. "You're sure about this?" Kelvin asked, his tone sharp now, tinged with suspicion. Kim nodded, her eyes wide with sincerity. "I wouldn't be telling you this if I wasn't sure. I heard him say it clearly." Kelvin leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Edward's loyalty had never been questioned before. They had built this company together, weathered countless storms side by side. Yet, the gravity in Kim's voice made it impossible to dismiss her outright. Why are you telling me this? Kelvin asked, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. Kim hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. Because it's the right thing to do. I know I'm just a waitress, but I couldn't let you walk into this blind. You deserve to know. Her words struck a chord in Kelvin. Here was someone with nothing to gain, risking her job, maybe more, to warn him. The sincerity in her voice made him reevaluate everything. Thank you, Kelvin said finally. His voice quieter now. I appreciate you telling me. Kim nodded, relief washing over her face. She quickly retreated, leaving Kelvin alone with his thoughts. The celebratory energy that had filled the cafe earlier now felt hollow. He glanced at the contract on the table, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. When Edward returned, his usual charm was intact. He smiled at Kelvin, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. Everything all right? Kelvin forced a smile, masking the turmoil in his mind. Yeah, just thinking over the deal. You know how it is. Edward chuckled. Course. Big decisions. But we've got this, Kelvin. We've worked too hard to let anything stop us now. Kelvin nodded absently, watching Edward closely. For the first time he saw him in a different light, not as a friend but as a potential enemy. The realization was gut-wrenching. I think I need a little more time, Kelvin said cautiously. Just to double-check everything. Edward's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he quickly recovered. Sure, take all the time you need. But don't wait too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often. Kelvin forced another smile. His decision already made. He wasn't going to sign anything until he knew the truth. As Edward turned back to his phone, Kelvin's mind churned with plans. He needed proof, and he knew exactly how to get it. Later that evening, Kelvin sat in his car outside the cafe. His thoughts a tangled mess. The betrayal, if true, would cut deeper than any business loss. But he wasn't naive. He couldn't afford to be. Pulling out his phone, he dialed a familiar number. Esther, it's Kelvin. I need your help. There's something I need you to look into. As he explained the situation to his trusted investigator, a sense of calm began to replace the chaos in his mind. He didn't know what the next few days would reveal, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't let Edward blindside him. As Kelvin drove away, his thoughts returned to Kim. Her courage had changed everything, and for that, he owed her more than gratitude. In a world filled with deceit, her honesty was a beacon of hope. Kelvin sat in his sleek modern office, the city skyline stretched out behind him. The evening light cast long shadows across his desk, where the contract for the deal with Edward lay unopened. The warning from Kim Johnson lingered in his mind, gnawing at the trust he had spent decades building with Edward. Edward had always been more than just a business partner. They were childhood friends, brothers in everything but blood. Kelvin's memories of Edward were a collage of shared triumphs and setbacks. Late-night brainstorming sessions, celebratory drinks after landing major clients, and quiet moments of camaraderie during the early, uncertain days of their company. It seemed impossible that Edward could betray him, but the sincerity in Kim's eyes had been unmistakable. He replayed her words in his mind. He's planning to take over your company and leave you with nothing. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Esther Nduka, his private investigator, stepped inside, carrying a slim tablet. She was dressed in her usual no-nonsense style, her eyes sharp and focused. Kelvin, she greeted, taking a seat across from him. I've started looking into Edward's activities. I wanted to update you before diving deeper. Kelvin gestured for her to continue, his jaw tight. What did you find? Esther leaned forward, her voice measured. So far it's just whispers. A few unusual financial transactions over the past 6 months. Small amounts, carefully timed, moved into accounts we can't immediately trace. It's subtle, but it's there. If he's planning something, he's being meticulous about it. Kelvin's stomach churned. Edward had always been careful with money, but this level of secrecy was unusual. Do you think he's using this to position himself for a takeover? Esther hesitated. It's possible. These transfers are small enough to avoid raising red flags, but if they've been ongoing, they could add up to something significant. I'll need more time to dig deeper. Kelvin nodded, his mind racing. He wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but the evidence, no matter how subtle, was unsettling. What do you need from me? Access, Esther said bluntly. If you want me to uncover the full picture, I'll need access to internal company records, particularly the ones Edward manages. If he's hiding something, it'll show up there. Kelvin's chest tightened. Giving her access to those records meant stepping into a territory of mistrust he wasn't sure he was ready for. But what choice did he have? I'll arrange it, he said, his voice firm. I need to know the truth. As Esther left, Kelvin leaned back in his chair, staring at the unopened contract. The celebration he had envisioned now felt hollow. His trust in Edward, once unshakable, was beginning to erode. The next day, Kelvin arrived at the office early, hoping to gather his thoughts before facing Edward. As he stepped into the building, Kim Johnson was wiping down the counter in the lobby cafe. She spotted him and hesitated, her expression uncertain. Mr. Agu, she called softly. Kelvin turned, offering her a tired smile. Kim. I just wanted to check, she began, her hands fidgeting with the cleaning cloth. Are you okay? Did you believe me? Kelvin hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. I'm looking into it, he said finally. What you told me. It's hard to believe, but I can't ignore it. Kim's face softened with relief. I'm glad. I was worried you'd think I was lying. Kelvin shook his head. No, Kim. I appreciate what you did. It took courage. She smiled faintly, but he could see the worry still etched on her face. I just hope it's not true for your sake. Me too, Kelvin said quietly. Me too. Later that morning, Edward strolled into Kelvin's office, his usual air of confidence intact. He wore a bright smile, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Thought I'd save you a trip to the cafe, he said, placing one on Kelvin's desk. Kelvin forced a smile. Thanks. Edward leaned back in his chair, the picture of ease. So, have you decided? Ready to sign and make history? Kelvin hesitated, his fingers tapping the edge of the contract. I think I need more time to review, he said carefully. I want to be absolutely sure everything is in order. Edward's expression flickered. Was it frustration? Disappointment? But it was gone in an instant. Of course, he said smoothly. Take all the time you need. I just don't want us to miss out on this opportunity. Kelvin nodded, but his mind was churning. Edward's response was exactly what it should have been, yet something felt off. The easy charm that had always been Edward's strength now seemed calculated, almost rehearsed. As Edward left, Kelvin stared at the coffee cup, untouched. His gut told him to trust his instincts. Something wasn't right. That evening, Esther called with an update. Kelvin, I've found something significant. What is it? Kelvin asked, his heart pounding. There are more transfers, larger ones, going into an offshore account. The timing coincides with the negotiations for this deal. It looks like Edward has been funneling money for months, possibly to set up a safety net or fund a takeover. Kelvin's grip on the phone tightened. How much money are we talking about? Millions, Esther said bluntly. It's not just small change. He's been planning this for a long time. The betrayal hit Kelvin like a physical blow. The man he had trusted most in the world had been plotting against him, siphoning money while smiling to his face. Keep digging, he said through gritted teeth. I need everything. That night, Kelvin sat alone in his study, the contract in front of him. The anger, disbelief, and hurt swirled together, leaving him unable to think clearly. Edward's betrayal wasn't just about money or business. It was personal. He thought of Kim, of her courage in warning him. Without her, He might have signed the deal and handed everything over to Edward without realizing it. Picking up his phone, Kelvin dialed Esther. Esther, I need to confront him, but I need proof, something he can't deny. Understood, she replied. Give me a few more days. I'll get what you need. As Kelvin hung up, he felt a flicker of resolve amidst the storm of emotions. Edward might have been plotting for months, but now Kelvin was ready. He wouldn't let his company or his legacy be taken from him. The following days passed in a haze of tension for Kelvin Agu. The once celebratory deal that was meant to solidify his legacy had turned into a test of trust, resilience, and strategy. Esther Nduka, his private investigator, had promised results, and Kelvin was holding on to that assurance as his anchor. His trust in Edward Ease, the man who had been his closest ally since childhood, was already shattered. All he needed now was concrete proof. Kelvin sat in his office, staring at his phone, willing it to ring. His mind was a battlefield of memories. Edward laughing over drinks, celebrating their first major deal, and offering him steadfast support during hard times. It was difficult to reconcile that image with the man who had been siphoning millions behind his back. The phone buzzed, jolting Kelvin out of his thoughts. Esther's name lit up the screen. He quickly picked up. Esther. I've got it, Esther said, her voice firm but grave. Kelvin, Edward's been setting up a complex web to hide his activities. Offshore accounts, dummy corporations. He's been planning this for over a year. Kelvin's heart sank. How much has he moved? Close to 5 million, Esther replied. But that's not all. I found email correspondence between him and some of your competitors. He's been positioning himself to take over the company and possibly sell off parts of it once the deal is signed. Kelvin's grip tightened on the phone. The betrayal ran deeper than he'd feared. Edward wasn't just trying to take the company. He was ready to dismantle everything they'd built. Send me everything, Kelvin said, his voice cold. I'm confronting him tonight. That evening, Kelvin arranged to meet Edward at their private office, a neutral space they often used for confidential discussions. Edward arrived on time, flashing his signature smile as he walked in. He carried an air of confidence, completely unaware of the storm brewing. Kelvin, Edward greeted warmly, placing his briefcase on the table. You look tense. What's on your mind? Kelvin gestured for him to sit. We need to talk. Edward's smile faltered slightly as he took a seat. This sounds serious. It is, Kelvin said, his tone sharp. I've been reviewing some things, Edward. Financial records, offshore accounts, communications with competitors. Care to explain? The color drained from Edward's face for a brief moment, but he quickly composed himself. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, leaning back in his chair with a forced chuckle. You've been working too hard, Kelvin. Maybe you're imagining things. Kelvin's eyes narrowed. Don't insult my intelligence, Edward. I got everything. The transfers, the accounts, the emails. You've been planning this for months. Stealing from me, from the company we built together. Edward's facade cracked. His smirk disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. So you found out, he said, his tone devoid of pretense. Kelvin leaned forward, his voice low and cutting. Why? After everything we've been through, why would you do this? Edward's eyes burned with resentment. Why? He repeated bitterly. Because I've been in your shadow for years, Kelvin. You're the face of the company, the golden boy everyone admires. Meanwhile, I do the dirty work and you get all the credit. I was tired of being invisible. Kelvin stared at him, a mix of disbelief and anger swirling inside him. So, instead of talking to me, you decided to betray me. To steal everything we worked for. Edward scoffed. Talk to you. You wouldn't have listened. You're too busy playing the hero to notice how I've been sidelined. Kelvin shook his head, the weight of the betrayal hitting him like a punch to the gut. You could have had anything, Edward. All you had to do was ask. But now, you'll get nothing. Edward leaned forward, his voice venomous. Don't think you've won, Kelvin. I've spent months setting this up. Freezing my accounts won't stop me. I have connections, leverage. You won't get rid of me that easily. Kelvin stood, towering over Edward. It's over, Edward. I've already spoken to my legal team. The accounts are frozen, the board is on my side. And your competitors won't touch you once they see the evidence. For the first time, genuine fear flashed across Edward's face. You think you can just erase me? I built this company too. Kelvin's voice hardened. No, Edward. You helped build it, but you've destroyed everything with your greed. You don't deserve to be part of this anymore. Edward stood abruptly, his fists clenched. You'll regret this, Kelvin. I promise you. Kelvin didn't flinch. The only thing I regret is trusting you. Edward stormed out, leaving Kelvin standing alone in the empty office. The silence was deafening, but Kelvin felt a flicker of relief. He had confronted the betrayal head-on and reclaimed control of his company. The next morning, Kelvin met with his legal team and Esther to finalize their strategy. They were filing a lawsuit against Edward for fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. The evidence was damning, and Kelvin was determined to see justice served. As the team discussed the next steps, Kelvin's assistant buzzed him. Kim Johnson is here to see you, sir. Kelvin smiled faintly. Send her in. Kim entered hesitantly, her hands clasped in front of her. Mr. Agu, I just wanted to check on you. I heard about everything. Are you okay? Kelvin gestured for her to sit. Thanks to you, Kim, I'm fine. You saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. Kim blushed, looking down. I'm just glad I could help. Kelvin leaned forward, his expression earnest. You did more than help. You showed courage most people wouldn't have. And I want to repay you for that. Kim looked up, surprised. Repay me? I know you've had to put your education on hold, Kelvin said. I'd like to help you go back to school. And if you're interested, I'd like to offer you a position here. You have good instincts, Kim, and I could use someone like you on my team. Tears welled up in Kim's eyes as she nodded. I don't know what to say. Thank you, Mr. Agu. Kelvin smiled. Thank you, Kim. For everything. As she left his office, Kelvin felt a sense of closure. The betrayal had been painful, but it had also revealed the people he could truly trust. With Edward gone and Kim by his side, Kelvin was ready to rebuild stronger than ever. Kelvin sat at his desk, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. The city skyline was bathed in golden light, but Kelvin's thoughts were elsewhere. The fallout from Edward's betrayal had left a scar deeper than he cared to admit. For weeks, his company had been in damage control mode, securing accounts, reassuring clients, and stabilizing operations. Though he had acted quickly to freeze Edward's assets and protect the company, the betrayal had shaken his trust in everything and everyone. But amidst the storm, one unexpected ally stood out. Kim Johnson. Kelvin had kept his word. Kim's courage in warning him had not gone unnoticed, and he had set the wheels in motion for her future. A scholarship application for her to return to school was underway, and she had officially joined the company as an assistant in the finance department. Kelvin had no doubt she would excel. Her instincts and integrity were what had saved him, and he was determined to give her the tools to build a better life. Kim sat nervously at her new desk. The sleek, modern office was a far cry from the cafe where she had worked for months. The employees bustled around her, all wearing tailored suits and polished shoes. Kim felt like an imposter in her simple blouse and skirt, but she reminded herself of why she was here. Kelvin had taken a chance on her. He believed in her potential, even when she struggled to believe in it herself. That thought alone gave her the strength to sit a little straighter and focus on the tasks in front of her. Kim. A voice interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Josephine Anderson, a senior manager and her assigned mentor, smiling warmly. Yes, ma'am, Kim replied, standing quickly. Relax, Josephine said with a chuckle. You're doing fine. I just wanted to check in and see how your first day is going. Kim hesitated. It's Overwhelming, she admitted. But I'm grateful for the opportunity. Josephine nodded knowingly. I've been where you are. Trust me, it gets easier. And from what Mr. Agu has told me, you've got what it takes. Don't doubt yourself. Kim smiled, feeling a flicker of confidence. Thank you. I'll do my best. Later that afternoon, Kelvin called Kim into his office. She entered nervously, clutching a notebook, unsure of what to expect. Kim, Kelvin began, gesturing for her to sit. How's your first day going? It's good, sir, Kim said, her voice steady despite her nerves. A lot to take in, but I'm learning. Kelvin leaned forward, his expression kind. Good. I want you to know that this isn't just about gratitude. You've shown me that you have sharp instincts and a good moral compass, qualities that are rare in business. I expect you to bring that same integrity here. Kim nodded, her resolve strengthening. I will, sir. Thank you for this opportunity. Kelvin smiled faintly. One more thing. If you ever feel overwhelmed, remember this. You've already faced bigger challenges and come out stronger. You belong here, Kim. Those words stayed with her as she returned to her desk, the weight of her doubts slowly lifting. Over the following weeks, Kim began to settle into her role. Josephine guided her through the complexities of corporate finance, teaching her how to analyze reports, identify patterns, and present findings. Though the work was challenging, Kim embraced it, eager to prove herself. Kelvin watched her progress from a distance, impressed by her determination. Every so often, he would stop by her desk, offering words of encouragement or asking for her input on a small project. Though the interactions were brief, they built a sense of trust between them. Meanwhile, Kelvin was working tirelessly to rebuild his company's reputation. Edward's betrayal had caused ripples of doubt among clients and investors, but Kelvin's swift actions had prevented a full-blown crisis. Still, the weight of the betrayal lingered. He often found himself replaying conversations with Edward, wondering how he had missed the signs. One evening, as he worked late, Kim knocked on his door. "Come in," Kelvin said, glancing up from his laptop. Kim stepped inside hesitantly. "I didn't mean to interrupt, but I noticed something in one of the reports. It might not be important, but I thought you should see it." Kelvin gestured for her to sit. "Let's take a look." As Kim explained her findings, Kelvin felt a spark of pride. Her observation wasn't just valid, it was insightful. It demonstrated the kind of critical thinking that could make a real difference. "Good work, Kim," Kelvin said, closing the report. "You've got a sharp eye." Kim beamed, her confidence growing. "Thank you, sir. I'm just trying to do my part." "You're doing more than that," Kelvin replied. "Keep it up." As the weeks turned into months, the company began to stabilize. Kelvin's leadership, combined with the dedication of his team, restored confidence among clients and investors. Kim, too, began to shine in her role, earning the respect of her colleagues and becoming an integral part of the finance department. But for Kelvin, the real victory was personal. The betrayal that had once consumed him no longer held the same power. He had learned to trust again, not blindly but wisely. And in Kim, he had found someone who reminded him of the values that mattered most: integrity, courage, and resilience. One evening, as Kelvin prepared to leave the office, he paused outside Kim's desk. She was engrossed in a report, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Kim," he said softly, drawing her attention. She looked up, startled. "Yes, Mr. Agu." Kelvin smiled. "You've come a long way. I hope you're proud of yourself." Kim's eyes softened, and she nodded. Thank you for everything." As Kelvin left, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. The storm had passed, and with people like Kim by his side, he was ready for whatever lay ahead.